I'm very excited to present this report today. I'll be brief. The starting point of all of that is that a progressive tax system is really a key pillar of our democratic societies. It's essential to strengthen social cohesion and trust in government. It is essential to fund the public goods and services like education, healthcare, infrastructure, the fight against climate change that are going to be the key engine of economic growth in the future. And it is essential to distribute fairly the gains from globalization. The problem is that there is now clear evidence, thanks to pioneering research that's been conducted in partnership with tax authorities in several countries, that the super rich pay proportionately less in taxes than other socioeconomic groups. That's what this chart shows here. When you include all taxes paid by people at all levels of government, including corporate taxes that are assigned to shareholders, and you compute their effective tax rate, how much these taxes represent as a fraction of income, you see everywhere where we have good data that the super rich have particularly low rates of taxation. And this is due to one specific issue, which is the failure of the individual income tax, normally the pillar of tax progressivity, to effectively tax the super rich. The super rich can avoid the individual income tax by avoiding dividend distributions and by avoiding realizing capital gains. And also in many countries, they can avoid the individual income tax by using holding companies or similar legal structures that shield their income from taxation. That's what the graph shows here. Same graph as the first chart that I showed, except that it's just looking at one tax, the individual income tax, expressed as a fraction of income. For most of the distribution of income, the tax is progressive, but then it falls to, in some countries, to nearly 0%, in countries like the Netherlands or France for billionaires due to the widespread use of holding companies. All right, so why is that a problem? It's a problem first because it deprives government from substantial amounts of tax revenue, and it's a problem because it fuels the rise of inequality. The report provides new computations on that. First, the facts. If you look at the wealth of global billionaires, as far as we can measure it, with the Forbes ranking of global billionaires back to 1987, this is the picture that emerges. In 1987, global billionaires owned in wealth the equivalent of 3% of world GDP. Today, they own the equivalent of 14% of world GDP. Or to put it differently, their wealth has increased at an average annual rate, net of inflation, of 7.1% per year, when average income at the global level has increased 1.3% a year per adult on average, and average wealth has increased 3.2% a year. Look, this is not sustainable. At some point, this will have to stop because it's not just a sustainable equilibrium for super rich individuals to see their wealth grow structurally faster than the wealth of the rest of the population. All right, so the blueprint that was commissioned by Brazil focuses on one simple proposal, which is to create a new common standard, a new internationally coordinated minimum tax that would ensure that global billionaires pay in tax each year the equivalent of at least 2% of their wealth. About 3,000 taxpayers, that's the number of billionaires, would be affected by this minimum tax, and it would raise about $200 to $250 billion in tax revenue annually. Okay, so what difference would it make? It would address the regressivity of our tax systems at the very, very top of the distribution. So this is illustrating this for high-income countries. Today, people with more than $1 billion in wealth have very low effective tax rates with an effective 2% minimum tax expressed as a fraction of wealth. The tax system, to be clear, would not be progressive, but at least the individuals with the highest ability to pay taxes wouldn't pay less than other socioeconomic groups. Let me just close the window a second. All right, that's going to be better. So that it would make a big difference to tax progressivity. The report also considers variation over that baseline scenario. So what would happen, for instance, if you extended the tax to centimillionaires, to people with more than $100 million in net wealth? That would also help to bend the curve, to remove that regressivity, this decline in effective tax rates that we observe at the top of the distribution today. Okay, so now let me discuss a number of issues. Why is there a need for international coordination? And I want to be very clear about that. There's a lot that countries can do on their own to improve the effectiveness of taxation for ultra-high net worth individuals. So it's not the case that we need a global agreement before we can start doing anything. That's just not true. But that being said, a coordinated minimum tax adds value for the very simple reason that in practice, the main obstacle in most countries to taxing the very rich is first the risk that they might hide income in relatively low tax countries, and second, the risk that they might move their residency to relatively low tax countries. And so to overcome those issues, you need international coordination. You need more information exchange across countries, and you need a common standard to avoid a race to the bottom, to curtail tax competition. It's exactly the same logic as the logic that underpins the global minimum tax on multinational companies. And we now know that we can do that because in 2021, more than 130 countries agreed on a minimum tax of 15% for multinational firms, what is known as the Pillar 2 of the OECD two-pillar process. And so we now know that international tax competition is not some kind of law of nature. And just like we can choose competition, we can also choose coordination. Okay, so another thing that's really important to clarify is that this common minimum standard is not a global wealth tax. It is a minimum tax that stays squarely in the realm of income taxation. The idea is that if when a billionaire, let's say, pays sufficiently enough in income tax, more than 2% of their wealth, let's say, then no extra tax is owed. And this happens sometimes when rich people realize lots of capital gains, they pay income tax, and so for them, nothing would change. By contrast, if one pays little income tax, then a top-up to the income tax would be applied to reach the common standard, the common minimum of 2%. The key to make it work is to define the minimum relative to something that's hard to manipulate. And for the super rich, the best reference point is wealth itself, because income is not very well defined for the very rich, but wealth, the market value of your assets, net of your debts, for billionaires is well defined. In technical terms, the minimum tax that's described in the blueprint is what is known as a presumptive income tax. If you are a billionaire and you report little or no income, you must in fact be presumed to earn, and in fact you do earn a lot of economic income, and the income tax should be applied to that economic income. Let me be very clear that this is not about creating some kind of global tax. The idea is to create a new form of coordination between countries while respecting national sovereignty. So the idea is to set a common standard that allows for flexible domestic implementation by countries using a variety of domestic instruments, such as a presumptive income tax, as I just explained, or a tax on a broad notion of income, including unrealized capital gains, such as was being proposed in the US by President Joe Biden. In his budget, he has a billionaire minimum income tax that would implement this global standard, this common standard, or third, through a wealth tax. Any of these instruments would qualify to implement the common standard, as long as at the end of the year, the super rich have paid a minimum amount of tax, let's say 2% of their wealth as a result. So just like the minimum tax on multinational firms, Pillar 2, this new international standard would in fact not require a multilateral treaty, but only domestic measures to implement some commonly agreed norm. All right, so let me discuss, before opening the floor for questions, let me discuss some of the main implementation challenges. Number one is how to value wealth. Of course, if wealth is as manipulable as income, then the minimum tax is ineffective. But what the research shows is that about half of the wealth of global billionaires today is held in shares of publicly listed companies for which market values are readily available. And the other half is primarily stakes in large private businesses. And by definition, if they're owned by billionaires, these are going to be large private companies. And we know how to value large private companies. That's what thousands of financial analysts do globally, looking at how similar publicly listed firms are valued by the stock market. And sometimes people are very concerned about the Picassos and the yachts and the boats. And look, these exist, but they just account for a very small share of wealth at the very top end of the distribution. So, my argument here is not that we can have truly perfect valuations for everybody, but that nonetheless, given the nature of wealth for the super rich, implementing this standard as a fraction of wealth would allow for massive improvement over the status quo. Second is, how do we do to simply know who is a billionaire to overcome the financial opacity that exists today? And the short answer is, look, tax evasion, it's what contemporary economic research shows, is that tax evasion is not a law of nature, just like tax competition. It's a choice. We can choose opacity, or we can choose to create transparency. And to some extent, we've already chosen to create a lot of transparency over the last 15 years. First, thanks to the automatic exchange of bank information in place since 2018 among more than 100 countries. We can build on that and extend that to include other assets which are not currently covered, such as real estate. Second, we've created transparency for multinational companies with the creation of country-by-country reports for multinationals, which are automatically exchanged between tax authorities. What the report explains is that what should be added to these country-by-country reports is information about the beneficial owners of the multinational companies. Who are the individuals who own, let's say, more than 1% of the stock of these multinationals? If that information was added, in effect, this would cover most of the wealth of global billionaires, because most of their wealth is stakes in multinational firms, private or public firms. Number three is perhaps the most important question is, okay, how could this work if there is imperfect coordination? And to be sure, the ideal is global participation, but it's also clear that a variety of political and geopolitical factors are likely to prevent, full participation in the foreseeable future. And that's not an obstacle to making a common standard work. The key to overcome that issue, to limit a race to the bottom, the risk of a race to the bottom, to curtail tax competition, is to include incentives in the common standard for countries to join. And so you can do that in two ways. Number one, you can strengthen existing exit taxes. For instance, countries could say, well, if our billionaires move to non-participating countries, then we will keep taxing them. We will keep subjecting them to the minimum tax, to the global standard after they've left. We can implement that today, in part thanks to the automatic exchange of bank information. And second, and most important, what's required, what's essential to make such an agreement work is to include provisions that you could call tax collector of last resort mechanisms that would say that, okay, if some countries choose not to tax their billionaires, at the end of the day, the participating countries will be allowed to tax them on their behalf. This is exactly how it works in the minimum tax on multinational companies, and we can build on those rules and translate them. There will be a need for global inclusive discussion about how to do that exactly, but we already know how to do that because it is a reality in the common minimum tax for multinational companies. So let me just conclude by saying that, a coordinated minimum tax on ultra-high net worth individuals is a powerful and, in fact, the most effective way to safeguard tax progressivity at the top of the wealth distribution and the income distribution. And thanks to recent progress in international tax cooperation, in large part thanks to the leadership of the G20 on these issues, such a minimum tax now on the super rich, number one, has become technically feasible, and number two, could be enforced successfully. So thank you so much for joining, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Gabriel. We already have a couple of questions, which I will read. Just to tell journalists that we are we are now, publishing it on the webinar chat, the executive summary and the report. The report is final in content, so still a few graphics that, we are working on that, but you can use it also under the executive summary as well. So, Gabriel, I have the first question from Elodie Lemmer, from a tax analyst, and she wrote, she's from Tax Notes International. Two quick questions. In the European Union, we have our freedoms, our four freedoms. So how should member states design any kind of design tax not to infringe those freedoms? And second, the report suggests some sort of public country-by-country reporting from individuals. How can we ensure that this would respect EU data protection rules?
Thanks a lot. So on the second question, no, the report doesn't propose public country-by-country reporting of wealth for ultra-high net worth individuals, but just that ultra-high net worth individuals should be required to submit information about their wealth, modeled perhaps in part on what multinational companies have to do, but confidentially to their domestic tax authorities. So it's not public reporting that's advocated in the report. Second, about the compatibility of the minimum standard proposed here with EU law, high-level answer, we've known how to do that with the common minimum tax for multinational firms. The issues are very much the same. We've done that through a directive in the EU to implement Pillar 2, and I think, if that idea gain traction at the global level, we could, build on that past experience to translate that common standard into domestic law in the EU.
Yes, thank you. Just for journalists, please write your questions on the Q&A button that you find on the left on the bottom, because I cannot now see who is raising their hand. So second question from Nico Beckett from Climate Table. He says, many ultra-high net worth individuals live in the global north. How much money would such a tax raise for the countries in the global south?
Thanks a lot for that question. So the report focuses on revenue estimation globally, for the world as a whole. So it doesn't provide revenue estimates on a country-by-country basis. It is something that would be useful to do in future work.
Yes, and Nathael Vitran de RFI, Radio France Internationale, you said that this tax would not require a multilateral treaty, but could be implemented by a group of countries, like for the minimum tax on multinational companies. How small, how small can this group of pioneer countries be for it to be effective?
That's a tough question, and it's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that question. It's clear that the larger the number of countries, the more effective the tax would be, and there's no magic formula. I do think that there is overwhelming popular demand when you look at opinion polls all over the world for this type of measures. That is, when you ask people, everywhere, whether they think super rich people pay enough in taxes, whether they support more progressive taxation on these individuals, everywhere you have 70, 80% of surveyed individuals who say yes. That's why fundamentally I'm hopeful. It might take some time, as Felipe said, but I'm hopeful that we will get there at some point. I think truly global participation by all countries is the ideal, but might be hard. However, participation by a large number of countries is something that I think is totally in the realm of feasibility and possibility. Look, 10 years ago, nobody believed that 130 countries could agree on a minimum tax for multinational companies. This was viewed as completely utopian. Now it's a reality. The minimum tax is already implemented by 35 countries, and dozens of other countries, more than 100 countries, are soon going to join in 2025, 2026. I think there's reason to believe that something similar could be achieved in the coming years.
Following up on this, the same subject, Martin Sandbu of Financial Times asks, bilateral tax treaties tend to define tax residence for income tax purposes in some detail. So how can you impose exit taxes on those moving to a non-cooperating jurisdiction?
That's a great question, and it would probably require a renegotiation. That particular measure, I mean, would probably require amending double tax treaties. The report touches on some legal considerations. At the same time, it also notes that as political discussion progresses, there will be real value added in having additional legal analysis of specific points, and that's typically one of those points that will require an even more detailed legal analysis. High level, you have to weigh the costs of the status quo against, there's the cost of inaction and there's the cost of reform. Renegotiating double tax treaties has some cost, but the cost of inaction is the $250 billion that governments lose each year because they are unable to tax super high net worth individuals. And so it's for at the end of the day, every citizen, every voter to kind of weigh the cost and the benefits of engaging into this new form of international coordination that's advocated in the report.
We have now, Gabriel, a number of journalists asking, let's say, variation of the same questions. What is the consensus built so far in terms of countries backing this proposal, and how also to move further in considering that in the United States, this is a specific question from Jim Cason from La Jornada, Mexico, who is based in Washington. Janet Yellen has already ruled out a global tax on the wealth of billionaires. So a large portion of the world billionaires live in the US. How would this proposal move forward without the US?
Okay, so these are really important questions. So 2 points. Number one, the conversation about this issue has started 4 months ago, in the meeting that was convened by Brazil in Sao Paulo at the end of February, meeting of finance ministers. It was the first time ever in the G20 or in the G7 that these issues were discussed, the issues of wealth concentration, of how to tax wealthy individuals, of the lack of progressivity of tax systems. The G20 has existed since 1999, 25 years, the G7 since the mid-1970s, 50 years. All that time, never before had these issues been put on the agenda. And I really want to praise Brazil, as many countries did in February, for putting that issue on the agenda. So it's very recent, and already in less than 4 months, we've had a number of countries expressing support for this idea, not only praising Brazil for starting that conversation, which I think is very important, but also saying more concretely, yes, this is something that deserves to be discussed, and that would be a valuable addition to our current forms of tax cooperation. That includes countries like, of course, Brazil, France, South Africa, Spain, Colombia, the African Union, Belgium, and many other countries are looking carefully into that and are looking in particular into the report to solidify a position. On the second question, I want to be very clear that it's not true that Secretary Yellen discarded this proposal. There are two conversations, and they tend to sometimes be confused. There's a question of whether there is value added in having a common standard for minimum taxation of the super rich, a flexible standard respecting national sovereignty in the way that I described, and whether there's a need fundamentally for more effective taxation of the super rich. And there's a separate conversation, which is, okay, if there was such a tax, if there was such an agreement, where should the money go? And would there be a case for doing international redistribution to use the revenues to fund, a climate fund or to fund transfers to low-income countries? And clearly, Secretary Yellen ruled out that second proposal. She said she's not in favor of a global wealth tax with international redistribution of the proceeds of the tax. I want to be 100% clear that we're not talking about a global wealth tax. We're not talking about international redistribution here. We're talking about essentially building on what has been proposed by President Joe Biden in his own budget in the US. He has a billionaire minimum income tax of 25% on the unrealized capital gains of billionaires, which, as explained in the report, not only would implement the proposed common minimum standard, but in fact would be even more ambitious than the proposed common minimum standard. But he has put that idea in his budget, and here the idea with this proposal is just to say, well, look, there's value in doing that in a common cooperative manner. Of course, countries can do that on their own, but if we do that, several countries, the largest number of countries possible at the same time, it's even better. Okay, and so because that's in the very budget of the current administration, of course, that this is very consistent with the official position of the current US administration.
Yes, thank you. Well, now there are a number of journalists asking variation of the questions. What are the next steps? So what will happen now in Rio de Janeiro, and what the G20 presidency? What's the Brazilian G20 presidency plan to bring this proposal forward?
Look, I can answer that question, and I don't know if Felipe wants to add to that, but my answer is that the proposal, the blueprint, is a technical document whose goal is to start and to feed a political discussion, to start a conversation, not to end it, to show the realm of possibilities, the challenges, which are real challenges that exist, how they could potentially be overcome, what are the potential issues, the potential ways to address those issues, to feed a political discussion. And now the political discussion is going to start. And I think, as Felipe said, it's going to take some time. Look at what happened with multinational companies. The base erosion and profit shifting process, BEPS, of the OECD, starting in 2015, the 15% minimum tax, Pillar 2, started being implemented in 2024. It took 9 years. I do think that precisely because of all the work that was done recently for Pillar 2, for the automatic exchange of bank information, there is hope that such a minimum tax on the super rich could see the light of day in less than 9 years, but nobody expects that it would see the light of day in 6 months. These are complicated issues that deserve a thorough, inclusive, global political discussion.
I have a question about one more question about.
I think Felipe wanted to add something to that.
Oh, yeah, please.
Just to add something very quickly, Giancarlo. Thank you so much, Gabriel. This was brilliant, and we are fully in agreement there. I can't talk much because I'm sitting in the negotiation room in the G20. But what I can say is that there is a lot of interest to talk about this proposal. And there's a very good sign. As Gabriel said, several countries already expressed that publicly, that they are interested in the discussion. And I think now we need to have parallel conversations, the conversations to be held within countries, talking about how this proposal fits that domestic tax reform ideas. And one of the big merits of this proposal is that it's quite flexible, so countries can implement this in different ways. So if they analyze that domestic endeavors at tax reforms and come to the conclusion that they are actually reinforced by this form of international cooperation, then we really have a way forward. And we are optimistic that we are in this process. Countries are listening, they are considering their plans, and they are seeing merit in international cooperation. Now, how fast can we advance? I'm not in a position to say, but I can promise that we'll keep pushing this issue as long as Brazil is the president of the G20. And beyond that, there are international taxation talks happening in other forums. And I think this is an issue that naturally will also be discussed in other forums.
Thank you, Felipe. One question from Marcela Iris from Reuters, again about the US. The report states that Joe Biden's proposal for a minimum income tax on the super rich is even more ambitious than the standard 2% wealth tax rate. Given this context, do you believe the United States will formally support the proposal at the G20 meeting in July? And how crucial is this support for the proposal to gain effective traction?
This is a question. Thanks a lot. This is a question you have to ask to the U.S. Treasury. I do think I want to emphasize that the proposal described in the blueprint really shares the objective and the logic of the billionaire minimum income tax in President Biden's budget in the US. You know, it's the same idea. It starts from the same analysis that our tax systems today fail to effectively tax the super rich. And second, that the best way to, at least a powerful way to address that is through a minimum tax on something that has to be much broader than traditional notions of income. It can be broad income, including unrealized capital gains, it can be wealth, it can be presumptive income, but this is the same analysis, this is the same objective, and the billionaire income tax in the US, as proposed by President Biden, is one way to effectively implement the standard. There is a conversation about the merits of international coordination on this issue. You know, sometimes some of the reaction that I could hear in the past was, okay, why is there value in doing that collectively? Why can't countries just, you know, on their own, better tax ultra high net worth individuals? And sure, they can do that. I want to be very clear. But there is value added in international coordination for the exact same reason that there is value added in international coordination for the taxation of multinational firms, which is that it helps prevent the risk of a race to the bottom. It would curtail international tax competition, and it would create new forms of information that would support the ability of national governments to implement that tax in a domestic context. I do think that the report, you know, clarifies that, and so I'm hopeful about, you know, the possibility of obtaining broad support, not only in the US, but in many countries.
Thank you, Gabriel. Ben Fox from EU Observer. What is the best forum to advancing this proposed tax? Will it be on the agenda for the United Nations Tax Convention?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, look, number one, the discussion is just starting. I think what I can say is that the G20 over the last 15 years has been very effective in putting bold ideas on the agenda. In 2013, it put the idea of an automatic exchange of bank information on the agenda, something that was deemed utopian before. In 2015, it put the idea of cooperation for the taxation of multinational firms on the agenda. And so the G20 has been really effective in terms of providing the political leadership to start discussions, technical discussions that eventually led to international agreements. I do hope that the same process will happen. At the same time, it's important, these issues deserve a truly inclusive global coordination. And so, look, in the future, it will be very important to have different bodies involved, I hope very much including the UN.
Tim Wallace at Daily Telegraph in the UK, he asks, Britain is likely to have a Labour government after next month's election. Is this a good moment to push for a wealth tax, in your opinion? Would you urge a new left-wing government with a big majority to use its position to take the lead on this tax?
So thanks for the question. Number one, this is not a wealth tax. I think by now it should be clear for everybody. Think of this really as a top up to the income tax. People who already pay a lot of income tax, nothing changes for them. People who pay, billionaires who pay zero income tax, their income tax would be topped up to reach the agreed minimum. This is what I'm advocating for. And I do hope that, yes, the UK government after the elections will play an important role in advancing the international discussion on this issue.
Yeah. Building up on this question, Eleanor Hughes from Associated Press, she asks, how many of these 3,000 billionaires you mentioned are not already paying the 2% in their respective countries? All of them, most of them, some of them? Do we have names? And also, what is the main geopolitical factor that could challenge implementation? Maybe the concentration, I would say, of billionaires in few countries.
Thanks a lot. I think, look, first, there is no public information about the taxes that are currently paid by billionaires individually. There is information about their wealth because there are reporting requirements to Securities and Exchange Commissions, to chambers of commerce, but there is no public reporting requirement about income, almost all about taxes and income taxes in almost all countries, with a few exceptions. So I don't have names to give you. We have studies that have been able to work, researchers who have been able to work in partnership with tax administrations, analyzing data in a confidential, highly confidential manner. And the conclusion of these studies is that globally, on average, given the data that we have, which is still imperfect and limited, but there is a growing body of work, on average, global billionaires pay the equivalent of 0.3% of their wealth in individual income taxes and wealth taxes when they exist. 0.3% is the average. The average is very low. It's way lower than the proposed 2% threshold. So it's reasonable to infer from that that most global billionaires are below the 2% threshold, but it's difficult to be more precise. Geopolitical fragmentation, yes, will likely prevent a full global participation in the foreseeable future. This is not an issue. Why? Look at the way it works for multinational companies. There is an agreement among 130 countries. Not all countries are part of the agreement. Some big countries actually are not implementing the 15% minimum tax. The US is not implementing the 15% minimum tax on multinational firms. It has not been ratified in Congress, and yet it's not an obstacle. Other countries are moving forward, and if some multinationals in non-participating countries pay less than 15%, the countries that apply the agreement will have the right to essentially collect the taxes that non-participating countries would choose not to collect. So there are these very strong built-in incentives for as many countries as possible to join the agreement. And I think that powerful approach, first of all, shows that it's not necessary to have truly global participation because there is this backstop. And second, could be translated, and it's a difficult question, how to do that exactly, and the report discusses this difficult question, but this could be translated to the question of the taxation of ultra-high net worth individuals.
I think you have already answered to the question from Laura Delle Femmine from El País, how you can, how this tax collector last resort would work. We have a question from David Booking from Der Spiegel. The administrative costs of raising wealth taxes in Germany in the past have been considerable, around a third of tax revenues. Would you expect similar costs, and what percentage would you consider acceptable? Of course, this is not a wealth tax, but still there is the need to measuring, the cost for measuring wealth.
Absolutely. Look, it's an important question. I think, really what we're discussing today is very, very different from wealth taxes that were implemented in Germany or in many other countries. Here, we're talking, in the baseline proposal, we're talking about taxing 3,000 individuals globally, 3,000 people. Half of their wealth is very easy to observe and to measure, is shares in companies that are publicly listed on the stock market. The other half, yes, it requires a bit of work to value large private companies, but it's not going to cost more than a tiny fraction of the expected $200 to $250 billion in additional revenue. Talking about a very small population for whom there is actually quite a lot of information about their wealth, and valuing private businesses for these 3,000 individuals is something that can be done.
We are running out of time. Maybe, Gabriel, do you still have 10 more minutes, let's say, to go till 10 after 5? Okay. Just a communication for journalists. We have posted the whole report, the full report, and the executive summary in the webinar chat, so you can download it from there. And a number of these questions, they are very well explained in both documents. So a question from Urmi Gosauni from the Economic Times of India. How do you think this proposal can be made more acceptable in countries, in particularly developing countries, where the number of billionaires is growing, but are relatively a new group? And how do you expect the wealth tax to impact investments by this group in the local economy?
Okay, so with the caveat that this is not a wealth tax, I think to think about the economic impacts of the standard that's proposing the blueprint, what's relevant is to do the following comparison. Global billionaires have had a return on their wealth of 7.5% on average per year over the last 4 decades, net of inflation and before any tax, 7.5%. They pay, as I said, 0.3%, the equivalent of 0.3% of their wealth in tax. So their rate of return, net of tax, is 7.5 minus 0.3, 7.2% today, on average over the last 4 decades. If the 2% minimum tax standard was enforced, their net of tax rate of return would still be 5.5% net of tax on average per year, net of inflation. Still very high rates of returns. The economic literature suggests that at that level of net of tax return, the adverse incentive effects of such a tax on work decisions, on capital accumulation, or innovation are likely to be a second order. We're also talking about a really tiny population, 3,000 taxpayers globally. So the likely impact on global or even country-level economic growth and innovation are likely, according to the economic literature, are likely to be really very small. On your first question of how to create political support in developing countries, I would just point to the fact that with these opinion polls that I discussed at the beginning, we have them for developing countries as well, and also in these countries. When you look at countries like Indonesia, for instance, in a recent poll, there was more than 80% of the population that was in favor of more effective taxation of the super rich. There is overwhelming popular demand for such measures.
Yes. Well, we have one question from a French journalist, André Manvit, and then three questions from Brazil that we'll try to put together. But the André Manvit from Media TV, he asks, in France, the current government is against taxes. It argues that they will slow down investment for jobs. How do you respond? Well, first, I mean, it seems that France, at least the Macron government, was in favor of this proposal.
So on the substance, whether such a tax would slow down investment and growth, I think I've already answered that. We're talking about very few individuals. We're talking about a modest 2% tax that would preserve very high rates of returns for billionaires. So the negative economic effects are unlikely to be large. On the position of France, France has been part of the countries that have expressed support for that proposal so far.
Yes. Now, a question from Brazil. Gabriel Benevides Poder 3360. He asked more or less, well, there will be a lot of pushback from lobbies, powerful lobbies in Congress everywhere. The wealthy will push back. And so are negotiations being held with the legislative powers of each country? Also, okay, well, more Brazil. And also, how exactly do you propose that the money raised can be used? Each government will decide about the destination. I would say that both questions go together.
Yes, look, taxation is not for economists or anyone to decide. It's for the people to decide through democratic deliberation and the vote. And in the same way, how taxes should be spent is for people to decide through the democratic deliberation, through their representatives in Congress. So this is certainly not for me to say how the money should be spent. I hope this discussion will start in the different countries soon. And on your first question of, yes, look, there will be pushback, of course, look, it would be naive to believe that the taxpayers involved will, all come out in favor and support this process. Look, there was pushback also for the minimum tax on multinational companies. Many multinationals don't like it, and yet it's a reality. So that I think, given the demand for such minimum taxes, I think we can be again reasonably optimistic while not being naive that yes, it will be a battle.
Okay. Vivian Oswald from a global newspaper in Brazil. The proposal, I mean, you in the report a number of options. They say this new minimum tax standard could be in the future also be adapted to ultra-rich individuals, but with less than 1 billion in total wealth.
Yes, absolutely. And look at what is in the billionaire minimum income tax of Joe Biden in the US. It's a tax that actually starts at $100 million in wealth. It would affect Americans with more than 100 million, That's why in the report, I also consider lowering the threshold to $100 million. We're talking about still extremely wealthy people. These are individuals, people who have more than 100 million, but less than a billion, that according to the data that we have, pay a bit more tax, to be clear, than billionaires. It's really for billionaires that effective rates collapse because for them, taxable income becomes a vanishingly small fraction of their wealth. And so there is revenue to be collected from centimillionaires other than billionaires. But the report estimates that it would be of the order of $100 billion to $150 billion that could be collected from implementing the standard on that population. That would come in addition to the $200 to $250 billion that could be collected from billionaires. From that perspective, and also because billionaires are much fewer in number, we're talking about around 3,000 billionaires as opposed to perhaps 60,000. It's difficult to know, perhaps in between 50,000 and 100,000 centimillionaires other than billionaires. And because billionaires are so few in number, pay so little in tax today, and the revenue potential from taxing them better is so large, it does make sense to start with billionaires. And then, there could be a legitimate discussion about lowering the threshold.
Yes. Look, you have partially already answered this question, but so how to avoid, this, let's say, the great escape of billionaires to more potential great escape of billions to more, let's say, friendly with the lower tax or countries that don't implement this position. In the report, if I may, it's explained that in fact in less than 25 years or so, the number of billionaires who moved from their home country to somewhere else as a whole is still under 10%. So you don't expect this number to increase significantly in the future, even if not when this proposal will finally be implemented.
Look, this is an important question. And yes, I do think that tax-driven mobility of wealthy people tends to be exaggerated in the public debate. That is, if you look at the most careful recent economic studies of that phenomenon, exploiting changes in wealth taxation in Scandinavian countries, or reforms to the non-dom regime in the UK a few years ago, people who have studied that very carefully, they do find some migration responses by the very wealthy people affected, but overall quite small, and certainly much smaller than what you sometimes hear in the public debate. Now, that being said, I do think it's a potential risk, and I do think that countries can take action to limit this tax-driven mobility of super rich people. They already do that, right? Many countries already have exit taxes that essentially ensure that rich people are taxed on their past income, including unrealized capital gains when they change their residency. And that approach could be extended a little bit by saying, well, look, for people who move to countries that would not implement the common standard, maybe the origin countries where the common standard is implemented could keep taxing those individuals after they've moved for a few years. That could depend on the number of years that these people have been resident in their origin country in the first place. So someone who has spent 40 years in, I don't know, let's say the UK, I assume the UK applies the common standard, and now moves to Switzerland, I assume that Switzerland does not apply the minimum tax, then the UK could say, well, look, we're going to keep taxing you for at least a number of years after you've moved. And the logic is very simple, is if you've become a billionaire in the UK, by living 40 years in the UK, that's because you've benefited, at least in part, from public goods and services, from education, from healthcare, from infrastructure. So, it's legitimate for us to keep ensuring that if you don't pay any tax in your new residence country, at least you're subject to a minimum amount of tax payable to us, the UK. And so the report explains how there are concrete mechanisms like that, building on what exists and strengthening those mechanisms to limit the risk of tax-driven mobility to non-participating countries.